Welcome back. The goal of today's lecture is to look at Chapter 6, Finding Variables of Measurements. Ignore the typo and the wrong course code. We will change that as we speak. So, there is a certain logic of measurement. We go through a certain number of steps before we actually get to the answers that we're looking for. And the logic of measurement is in deciding how variables should be measured. As a researcher, you're faced with three major issues that require careful consideration. First, what varies? Then the second question obviously is, well, if something does vary, how do we capture that variation? How to measure? And finally, how do we report what we measure? Okay, so your textbook suggests a logical sequence of how we go about getting to the units of measurement. We first define the concepts that are associated with our research. We go on to select variables. A variable, as you know, is a concept of a type which represents the entire concept. So it's a subset. So it can be observed, it can be measured. Once you know what the variables are, you still have to devise a measuring instrument. And finally, you have to determine what the units are. In the social and behavioral sciences, researchers do not have the same level of agreement about the nature of common variables. They don't necessarily agree on how things are measured. If we're talking about in the natural sciences, if we're talking about length, other than determining whether it's going to be in centimeters, meters, or a metric system, or whether it's going to be in inches, yards, which is the imperial system. Really, there isn't that much disagreement. Most of the world uses the metric system, so it's pretty standard to have the length in centimeters and meters, weight in grams and kilograms, and so on. This is a picture from your textbook. It provides different examples in the physical sciences. If the concept is physical growth, you can have height or weight, and your measuring instrument is a ruler, or you have scales for weight, and then see the units. The same is for heat or fever or vehicle performance, drunk driving, tire performance, and so on. It's not very hard for different natural scientists to get together and agree upon what the measuring instrument or the units of measurement are. With social sciences, it can get tricky because if you think about different concepts, and we'll look at a few concepts in just a second, it gets challenging. If you think about concepts such as educational attainment, marital satisfaction, social connectedness, you can think of many more such concepts. Your textbook has several examples too. You can have multiple variables that scientists will use to measure any of these concepts. So two scientists could be measuring the same concept in different ways, and there can be disagreement. If there's going to be so much disagreement, why should you even bother measuring in the social sciences, since everyone's going to be talking about One person's talking about apples, another one's talking about oranges. The reason it's still important to measure in the social sciences is when we think about measurement, we collect data in a focused manner. Imagine that three of you in this classroom decide to, let's pick one of these, decide to measure marital satisfaction amongst couples married for more than 5 years. Some of you might, if you haven't previously discussed as to what you're studying, one variable studied by one person could be activities done with each other by couples. Second person could end up measuring number of arguments per week. And a third person could measure sexual frequency. So it's actually more confusing than having clarity. And can you imagine if you don't define the concept, or if you don't define the variable you're measuring, then as an individual researcher, you're stuck with three potential variables to measure, making things complicated for yourself as well. The second reason why in the social sciences we still measure is because it streamlines and increases efficiency. We can obviously collect data using interview schedules and tally sheets in an organized manner, and this way the data is clearly available and organized for analysis. Even in the social sciences, any good researcher needs to make consistent and disciplined observations. Okay. So unless you define what you're looking for, if, for example, you're studying the principles of neglect, so whatever you're studying, if you have defined it very clearly, if you're talking about neglect or negligence in a long-term care home, if you have defined what factors look like neglect, it's very easy for you to consistently observe and look for patterns. Finally, if you have a clearly defined measure for a variable, it's easy to demonstrate the change in that variable and the understanding of the change in a certain context. So the way we measure variables is we measure it through data collection. In the social sciences, data is collected in 4 different ways. Once we know what our measure is, we have to start collecting data. Data collection is alternatively referred to as measurement. Data can be collected through observation. Data can be collected through interviews. It can be collected by examining records, and data can obviously be collected by performing experiments. In quantitative research, pretty much these 3 steps can definitely be used. Experiments are a little trickier when attempting to use a qualitative approach. When it's a quantitative methodology, even when scientists have different methods of measuring their variables, they articulate why a certain variable is a reasonable representative of a certain concept, and they define their measuring instrument, or they describe their measuring instrument and the units that they might be considered expressing their data in. So in the case of observational data, often what happens is the point of observation, just to get started, is to watch what happens. In observational data, the question is, do we simply have a look? And the challenge with simply having a look is you don't know what you're looking for. So you actually look for something that's very well defined and linked to the hypothesis. So think about the example. If we want to talk about distracted behavior, This is an example from your textbook. What does distracted behavior in elementary school students look like? So, lack of eye contact, lack of focus with lesson, looking at peers, fidgeting, talking to other students, disturbing other students, so the key thing to remember is even if you're observing for distracted behavior for students, as an observer, you'd have to have a list of what looks like distracted behavior. So it has to be defined. It has to likely be defined before the start of the observation process. Obviously, if additional behaviors are observed in addition to what the researcher has defined, they may need to add that to the checklist. There are several requirements for a proper observational study, and you must first decide what you will observe and what you will state. This is important to prevent yourself from being distracted. The second thing is to define where you will look or where you will conduct your observation, what time it'll be, and so on. Your textbook has an observation experiment, the description of an observation experiment talking about driving infringement. So I believe the hypothesis is that drivers cause more traffic violations closer to Christmas. Oops. And I believe that's the example. If you are a student who's conducting an experiment of this type, one of the things you will use is called a data collection sheet. A data collection sheet can be drawn out by hand or a printout, and it's essentially a table where you are tallying things up. So if hypothetically you were at an intersection and you're starting to score for cars that break red lights or don't stop in time, and you're trying to see, well, is there a correlation of the color choice of a driver and the infringement, or you're simply interested in knowing what the distribution is by color. It may not be color of the car, it may be gender of driver, and so on. So then you start to collect data. Typically what you do is, rather than write a final number, which is called the frequency first, you just start to make tick marks. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5 is with a slash. This is typically when statistical data collection is done. That's how it occurs. Data collection sheets. This might be from, say, maybe this sheet is from Monday. Good researchers will require data collected over multiple ranges of time to see if the hypothesis is accurate, maybe over several days. So you might have a similar sheet for Tuesday, then one for Wednesday, and so on. By the end of a week, you might have 7 or 8 sheets, and you might be able to summarize the number of red light violations. Then the key is, well, once you have all these violations, how do you document them so they're in a compact form? And we'll look at that in a couple seconds. So, in order to prepare for data collection, there are a few different steps, and this checklist is available in your textbook as well. You have to select a concept, select the variable that represents the concept. You have to have a means for measuring that variable. And finally, you have to have a means for recording the data. Now, in the example of traffic violation, the concept was traffic violation or traffic infringement. Let's just write that here. The variable, the thing that you're going to measure, is a red light. Now stop on red light. The means for measuring those variables would be, well, you'd use an observation checklist. Would be simply observation. You'd observe and record that data on checklists. So if you can also observe for different things. We spoke about distraction in class. If we had a hypothesis that boys are more distracted than girls in the classroom, we can look at a checklist for classroom behavior. I really like how they worded creatively. This is from your textbook. The researcher, and of course, the teacher's name is T. Scher. All very humorous. But more interestingly, the idea is that when you're observing disruptive behavior, it's already previously been defined as these are the different things that are considered disruptive. And then there's a measurement occurring between two different children in a classroom. Observation checklists can be a little different when we're looking at attitudes. If we're trying to see whether, the gender of a person determines whether their opinion is accepted or not, the checklist would be a little bit different. You might have a checklist for each individual, and which looks something like this, where you're listening or looking at a video recording of the entire conversation, and you're seeing if a certain topic, their opinion or idea is rejected or ridiculed or ignored, or if it's interrupted, if it's discussed, praised, or adopted. This is a different kind of observation checklist. So you can observe conversations, you can observe classroom behavior, you can observe a bunch of things. And the variables obviously would be things like rejection, ridicule, being ignored, interrupted. These are all the variables. And you'd measure those variables by a yes or no, and it would be on the sheet. In the social sciences, we also collect data using interviews and questionnaire. An interview is an interactive data collection process, and it is quite intimate in the sense that the interviewer and the interviewee interact, and there's a rapport built, and the interview often collects a lot of information, some of which is very personal. Interviews can be, it is recommended that interviews be recorded in order to maintain the rapport between the interviewer and the interviewee. Can you imagine furiously scribbling notes while someone's talking to you? And can you think about how comfortable they would be speaking to you while you're looking down at the sheet and not really making good eye contact and so on? So it's often a good idea just to ask for permission to tape record the interview and proceed with having a nice conversation with the interview question or questions in mind. Questionnaires tend to be a little bit different because they are self-reported by the participant. Usually the interviewer is not involved in the process. And there is a limited opportunity to expand on responses provided by someone responding to a questionnaire. There are several commonalities in either an interview setup or with questionnaires, even though they are quite different. The objective in setting up interviews or questionnaires should be to collect relevant data and not go for a fishing experiment. As researchers, we should resist temptations of personal curiosity. So you might be interested, for example, in knowing about the challenges and the barriers faced by an individual who is from an LGBTQ+ community. You might be curious to know how many sexual encounters they've had, and of what type, of what nature. But that's your own personal curiosity and has nothing to do with the data collection process or the research that you're doing. So it's a good idea to not have questionnaires or interview questions that are of personal curiosity nature. Always, for good questionnaires or interviews, plan and prepare. When you think through your questions carefully, you might start off with a long list of questions, but when you think through what each question is attempting to ask, you may actually throw away a lot of questions because they are not necessarily answering your research question in the first place. So, if you were to set up a questionnaire to understand the relationship of the number of hours studying and its correlation to better marks, you might have a sheet handed out to a student who is willing to offer information regarding how many hours they studied in 2 weeks over a 2-week period and what their final exam mark is. And once you have a bunch of these sheets here, you can compile them all together so you have different student IDs and you know how many hours they studied and you have a certain mark for them. So this would be one way to collect data from a questionnaire. Now, as the data set becomes larger and larger, you may want to organize the data into categories. So instead of saying having the precise number of hours per student, you talk about the hours studied, you split that up into different categories or different ranges, less than 30, 31 to 40, 41 to 50, 51 to 60, and so on. And then you start to count or add the number of students who fit into different categories. So, perhaps you had 5 students who studied less than 30 hours, about 12 studied 31 to 40, and so on. And these are their individual marks, for example. And then you may want to streamline that data by talking about the average mark, which might just be the mean of all the marks the students got. And you might add a second level of analysis, which is a standard deviation. If you haven't taken a statistics course, the standard deviation is the measure of the distance of each of those individual values from this mean value. In any case, as data starts to get more organized and starts to accumulate and you start to organize it more, it starts to acquire a more complex, a more nuanced look to it. And this data eventually can be graphed as well, and the graph might look something like this. And depending on what kind of graph it is, if it's a proportionality, it would be a pie chart. If you're looking at the independent and dependent variables, it could be a line graph or a bar graph like this. In any case, the point is don't focus so much on the graph itself. The point is, as you collect data and it gets more complicated, you will go through multiple transfer instruments, so to speak, to focus the data and to get to where you want to be able to express what you've collected. There are several do's and don'ts of questionnaires. For each question, what we should do, and these rules apply to interviews as well. We should do for each questionnaire is ask, how important is this question? What concept does it answer, or what variable is it measuring for a certain concept? Keep the question direct and simple. Don't try to ask too many things in a question. So if you want to ask, in the past 24 months, on how many occasions have you taken leave of absence from your work and your activities at home to take up temporary residence in another facility, another location for recreation, relief, or stress, and a conscious perception of a change in environment? That is a mouthful, and that's just too much. It's easier to ask, in the past 2 years, how many times have you taken a vacation? Often, questionnaires will have something called a background or a demographic fact sheet. These sheets need to be relevant to the research. You don't need to have curiosity-based questions, personal curiosity-based questions on there. Always when you put a question out, look for either an evaluation or a fact in a question. Don't try to look for both. For example, if you're concerned about children's screen time, there's really no point in asking the question to a parent, how do you feel about your child's screen time, and what is it doing to their academic performance? So you're asking for an evaluation and a piece of factual information. Do one or the other. The questionnaire should be directed to the correct person. So there's no point in handing out a questionnaire to an employer asking them, well, how many bathroom breaks does your employee take on an average workday? That makes no sense. The more specific your questions are in a questionnaire, the more specific answers you'll get. Try to avoid offensive questions. So if you're talking about people's dietary or nutritional habits, don't ask people in the questionnaire, do you still eat with your hands? That's offensive. Okay, that seems there is a tinge of inappropriateness in that question. Try to avoid offensive questions. Try not to use acronyms. There's no point in asking people, well, with the conclusion of the recent BAFTA meeting, all parties seem to be dissatisfied. What are your thoughts? Or if you're talking about, let's say if you're talking about the research agencies and funding and taxes going towards funding, and you ask a question regarding the CIHR, SHIRK, or NSERC, and this question is being handed out to the average person, these acronyms are more confusing. The issue with handing out a question with acronyms is if people don't know what those acronyms are, there's a very good chance that they will either wrongly answer the question or choose not to answer it at all. Don't ask two questions in one. Each item should be just one question. So asking a question such as, should we raise tax and use the tax money to support art? No, don't do that. Using colorful language obviously is not useful. For example, what is your opinion on the fact that sugar is white death? Don't ask questions which put people in an impossible situation, because again, it's a question people won't answer. So for example, have you stopped sexually abusing young children? That's an impossible situation. Don't ask impossible questions. Don't make assumptions that compromise the study. So asking children about, say, what job their father does, as part of surveying the children, is making an assumption that every child is in a family with a father and a mother. And those kinds of assumptions compromise studies. The final do for your questionnaire is test run your questions, have multiple friendly people go through your questions and attempt to answer them, because that's feedback for you to understand whether the questionnaire will run smoothly or not. One of the things we also do in the social sciences is we measure attitudes. It's important to measure attitudes in several situations, and people set up something known as attitudinal scales. And the reason you set up attitudinal scales is if you walk up to someone and ask them, hey, are you a racist or are you a sexist? How likely is it that you'll get an honest answer? Okay, if some of you are chuckling, well, I mean, I was hoping that it would be a little funny. But anyway, the point is, it's actually, you can't ask people that question because you'll not get an honest answer most of the time. So this is the example of an attitudinal survey that we created in class with students regarding what the attitude is concerning smart bills. There's in your textbook there's an attitudinal survey measuring sexism. So the idea is these attitudinal scales tend to have something called a Likert scale. Your Likert scale is the instrument of measure, and usually it has 5 or 7 things. In this case, it has 5. So it has a strongly disagree, a neutral, an agree, and a strongly agree. Scientists will often give a numerical value to it, and it could go from 1 to 5. Or alternatively, it could go 0, -1, -2, 1, and 2. So the scale can be set up in many different ways. And typically, the way the questions are set up, achieving a high score indicates a certain type of attitude, and the opposite is true if you accomplish a very low score. One of the important concepts here in Likert scales is called flipping of the scale. What that means is one of these questions out here is a question in which if someone's consistently just picking strongly agree because they figured out that, well, if I say strongly agree makes me sound like I'm approving the use of smart pills, or strongly agree makes me look like I'm completely non-sexist. And they keep picking that without necessarily reading the question or thinking about the question, which indicates, the true attitude. When you flip a question around, if you pick the same end of the scale, which shows the researcher that this person hasn't been genuinely answering. So in most situations, for an attitudinal scale where the wrong kind of question has been answered a certain way, those sheets are tossed out. So there are some basic rules for developing scales. So there are several questions that you can have on an attitudinal scale. You might have hundreds of items, but you can't put hundreds on a list because people would get bored and they simply wouldn't respond to such a comprehensive scale. It's a good idea to narrow down to about 10 or 15 questions, which have been shown to be effective in measuring a certain variable for a concept. Each of those questions should measure something. each question, an item means a question. An item should state just one issue. All the items on a scale must add to a different aspect of the same theme or same concept. I'll go ahead and say same concept. Because if you remember, a concept is a collection of several different variables. So if your concept is racist or racism, if this is a big basket, imagine this to be a big basket. Okay, there are several things that occur in racism. There's the avoidance of physical contact. There's avoidance of communication. There's a denial of opportunity. And you can think of many different items that are representative of racism, or can accurately be attributed to the broader general concept. So when you have a broad concept, an attitudinal scale can have different items that actually measure different variables. And the range of responses must be designed so that you can capture the entire dimension, which means you should be able to measure people who are completely open and liberal, and you should be able to measure on the same racism scale. Each question should be able to capture the person who's a total liberal and the person who's an absolute racist. Weak questions and weak responses should be avoided. And there's a whole section in your textbook that talks about what strong responses to questions look like, what weak responses to look like, what strong questions look like, and what weak questions look like. So we have covered how we collect data using observations, interviews, questionnaires. The third most important way in collecting data, in measuring variables, is by examining information kept in records or in official reports of organizations. For example, if you're looking at Stats Canada records, you're looking at hospital records, you're looking at surgeries, patient admissions, accidents, deaths, etc. Or maybe you're looking at articles that are published. So when you look at records and publications, obviously you have national, provincial, and organizational documents. There are some basic challenges, obviously, with examining records or reports. I apologize for the typo. And the challenge is access. So several times there are records that you wish to access, and they may not be online. They may be in a certain library situated somewhere. There's physical access. Sometimes there's specific permission required to access those records and so on. For the most part, public records are relatively easily available, even if they aren't online, as long as you can get to the location that they're stored in. Sometimes finding out records can be, like the very nature of records can be challenging because they can be in different forms: paper, film, microfiche, computer files, uncollated documents, and the permission process to examine documents that are historical in nature, that are sensitive to exposure to the environment, it becomes a little bit challenging. Obtaining specific records by the desired location or time period can be challenging also. Sometimes there's data collected for one particular research reason, and then using such public data for a second reason might be difficult because there is always a secondary use challenge, which means if the data collected for a certain research project is easily publicly available, but it hasn't been collected for a secondary use, then the researcher is required to at least attempt to figure out from their research and ethics board if that is a reasonable pursuit for them. Anyway, once you look at data collected in public databases, the objective is to go and look at the content. This process is known as content analysis. It is a way to examine records. The records may be not just words, it could be images, it could be ideas. Obviously, words and phrases are also important, but it may also be analysis of television clips. There are several steps when we do content analysis. So even in content analysis, we have to specify what the research objective is. We have to specify what are the variables for the concepts that we are hoping to measure and how we might be measuring them. We also have to define what our unit of analysis is. For example, if we're talking about, let's say, what do you want to talk about? Older adults exposed to fraud. Victimized by fraud, let's say victimized. Are we going to say our unit is each incidence of fraud uncovered? Or are we going to suggest that our unit of analysis is going to be the number of newspapers that cover such topics or so on? That must be defined. Again, even for content analysis, much like observation and interviews, you need a data summation sheet to collect the data, and so on. And you have to be able to summarize results. A summation sheet might look something like this. If you're doing content analysis of videos and looking at instances of disempowerment for Aboriginal people, this might look like having dismissive language, having patronizing attitudes, and so on. So the number of incidents are counted by the researcher as the video is playing, and they go, okay, well, that's 5, 6, 7, 8 in this video. And this video might have 3 instances. This video might have a whole bunch. So as the researcher is watching the video, they're just going check, 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 and they're getting an understanding of what's going on. And this is a quantitative way to do it. A qualitative way to do it is to look at the incident that occurs and perhaps see it several times to understand the context in which this incident was created and how it came about. And the data summation sheet would look different, because instead of having absolute numbers in a qualitative project, that would have a description of what occurred, how it occurred, what the context was, and so on. Again, even when you do content analysis of published material, there is a logical flow of the research process. So if you remember, you start with concept. What's the concept that you're looking for? So if you're looking for, say, marginalization of older adults, in familial settings. And what you're doing is you need to define a variable. What is it that changes? Opinion included. is if you can have a bunch of different things that you can check off, and then what's your measuring instrument. Your measuring instrument might be your sheet of paper or your Excel file, and then what are your units of measurement. So if you've noticed throughout this process, the way we collect measurable data or empirical data remains pretty much the same. Finally, taking the example of older adults being portrayed as somewhat disengaged and unaware. So we're looking at news items. Let's say we're looking at news items, we're looking at how older adults are portrayed. As we're looking at the summation sheet, we find that there are at least 35 items where they're always portrayed as somewhat disengaged, 20 when they're sometimes portrayed as being disengaged, and there are probably 5 items where they're never portrayed as being disengaged. Same thing, are older adults being portrayed as vulnerable due to their perceived lack of understanding of technology? I'm making these numbers up, but I'm just showing you what a summation sheet could look like as you're measuring age-based stereotypy for older adults and you're looking at videos. So, bottom line, this chapter exposes you to why we need to measure in the social sciences and why it's important to set up our measuring instruments and units of measure to be able to actually measure all of these different situations, and how we actually end up measuring or looking for data quantitatively in observations, in interviews, in questionnaires, or in written material and content. We didn't go very much into qualitative analysis of collecting data by all of these methods. More of that occurs in, I believe, lecture 12 or 13. I'm not entirely sure, but we will address that before the end of the course. So don't worry too much about it. Just recognize that, there are both, depending on what kind of question you wish to answer, there are different ways of collecting the same data. All right, well, go ahead, read your chapter as always, answer the questions in the back, and we will see you for lecture 7 soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.